Great, thanks Jason for the invitation to talk. Today I really want to talk about the opportunities for space reallocation in transition zones in our towns to help create more equitable spaces. And to me, the real value of DMIRS is that it recognises that our roads run through many different towns and villages around the country, and they all have very different characteristics. So then it really follows that different design solutions should be applied in different places to take account of this variety and local context. And as Jason was saying, following the publication of DMIRS in 2015, TII developed a design standard for transition zones, and this was published in 2018. And the aim really was to supplement and provide additional guidance to the information provided in DMIRS. So both documents are to be used together when designing schemes on national roads and be complementary. And then as part of the review in 2019 of DMIRS, a number of advice notes were issued, and one of these related to transition zones. So what is a transition zone? Well, a transition zone is the zone between the rural environment and the more urbanised settlement core. And it's really an area where speed reductions need to occur when entering an urban area from a higher speed road. It's a place where there's increased pedestrian activity, and when the character of the street really changes as land use and intensifies. So the aim is to move away from signage and regulation to using the streetscape to indicate changed road user priorities. So why do we have a DMIRS and a TII document? Well, just to clarify the role of both of the transition zone design advice. So DMIRS is mandatory for all urban roads and streets within the 60 kph zone, and this includes gateways, which both inner and outer gateways, town core, transition zone and residential zones. So it sets out very practical design measures for placemaking and to encourage more sustainable travel. And then the TII standard, as we said, complements it, and it describes the requirements in particular for national roads. And it's in terms of the provision of traffic calming also within the 60 kph, but in addition, it covers the rural fringe, which is the section of road on the approach to the 60 kph. And I'll just briefly mention the rural fringe in that it's the area between really the high speed road and the lower speed sections of road. And it's generally about 500 metre sections on the approach to the speed limit. And one of the key design challenges is that the rural fringe looks very similar to the rural sections. So there can be a very abrupt change in terms of the streetscape of towns and villages, especially if there's hard shoulders. There's a lot of safety considerations in the rural fringe, which don't apply in the 60 kph, which again limits the design tools. So it's an area we're working on in TII, and though it's outside of the DMIRS, it's important to see it in the context of the journey through the town. So, well, the transition zones typically contain several community facilities, generally have schools, sports clubs, churches, health facilities, open spaces, larger retail developments and light industry. And the streets and transition zones really can create these important safe and green connections between these different land uses and densities of development. And the transition zone document also deals with gateways. Both documents do actually, and it kind of, you can see the different focus of the documents in a sense, because the DMIRS advice note looks at gateways as points that signal a change of context or a point of arrival. The TII definition is really focusing on changing indicating where there's a change in speed limit, but they're both incredibly complementary. And again, it's to have as many functions out of the gateways, and they're also an important identity to the town in indicating your entry into a community. So just briefly, gateways, the scale of them really depends on their location, the scale of the space they're in, and also the speed and pace of the viewer. I added a slide here about the rural fringe, because talking with Leonora Neyman earlier in the week about Ennis, we were just talking about how, a lot of towns and villages, their gateways can be of the motorway network, which again is in TII's remit. And so, how do we look to that speed reduction from a motorway through to a gateway? The second image there is Burr, which is a really lovely sculpture, which is at the gateway to the town, but it's also combined with really strong avenue planting. and planting used to define active travel as well. So it sets up a very strong kind of procession through to the town. And then you go right through to smaller villages where obviously the scale is much smaller, the roads are much smaller. This is Keadoo and Roscommon, which, you know, again, a very strong planting palette at the start to really catch the eye as you're coming to the 60 kph. And the other thing that we really want to look at is opportunities when developing the initial visions for schemes. You know, traditionally the focus tended to be on the transport function of road schemes, traffic numbers, you know, transport and engineering requirements. But, you know, we really need to move this focus to away from that and recognize that really successful streets have other elements that are key, you know, water management, biodiversity, landscape, and opportunities for the local communities. So, you know, many times the street might be the only really public space in a village. So, you know, all of these threads need to weave together to make the most of the space. You know, we need to really look at how transport investment results in advantages beyond just network efficiency, you know, have this systems approach, if you like. And again, this thinking very much aligns within ourselves and TII with their sustainability implementation plan, which really looks for all our projects to benefits for all of society, and also then the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So just in terms of reference and guidance, in terms of transport, obviously there's DMIRS, there's also the new cycle manual that's due to be published. As Jason said in the intro, there's the pollinator friendly management of transport corridors and bringing biodiversity. We have the new interim guidance on SUDs, and actually DCC have a really good sustainable drainage design guide. And then really following on from DMIRS, we're looking at who is using the streets and looking at design tools to focus on particular street users, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. This is a slide that I actually borrowed from Mick Bradley. Thank you, Mick, for letting me use it. He talked in one of the series earlier where it struck me. He was talking about how, you know, our town centres are the heart and that we're the blood cells. You know, and not being too cheesy, but in a way, transition zones are the arteries. You know, is it kind of counterproductive to spend money and time enhancing town centres if there are poor and clogged routes to hinder people from sustainably accessing them? And again, we need to look at the full system. So one of the key characteristics of many of our transition zones is that generally we have space. And this is unlike in most, say, town centres where, you know, space can be at a premium. So in transition zones, when applying both placemaking and traffic calming measures, we do have this opportunity to reallocate space in a more equitable way. And there's some examples of transition zones. All of the examples, I suppose, I'm going to be using are national roads because that's where we focus on in TII. But you can see that, you know, applying standardized technical guidance really gives quite a standardized approach, I suppose. And generally in these areas, there's excessively wide carriageways. Tends to be little active travel and, you know, quite poor sense of place, really. So, you know, if we look at reallocating space, we can best to see how our streets can achieve the sustainability vision. You know, we can have space made for walking, cycling, and landscape, which has multiple functions. And again, you know, by creating more pleasant streets with multiple functions, then you encourage a wider range of users. You get more ecosystem services in terms of, you know, carbon sequestration, pollution control, water management. And, you know, if we just say focus on water management, you know, for example, trees catch rain in their foliage and branches, and some of that evaporates while the remainder is slowly released back to the ground. You know, and the SUD's function, of course, increases as the tree matures. So we need to ensure that they're planted to ensure good future growth. Tree root growth actually is also important because that decomposition of roots increases soil infiltration rates and overall soil infiltration capacity. And the very act of reducing the carriageway width reduces the load, say, on existing drainage system, which are most often combined drains. You know, buffers between paths and cycleways create filters, which also absorb pollutants. And if we look at community, you know, people movement, you know, because there's a lot of schools in transition zones, providing safe routes to schools can establish walking and cycling patterns at an early age. You know, the more people who are out and about, the less social isolation, which results in impacts on mental health. The more eyes on the street, the less crime. So again, these functions need to be considered. Biodiversity. Street trees can contribute, to example, for an increase in the number of bird species, especially when they're connected to blocks of green along the transition road zones, such as, say, sports areas or hedgerows. And it's actually really important that we retain existing trees and hedgerows because, they're established natural communities with their own interactions. Trees sequester and store carbon. They've got a cooling effect. So, they're one of the few climate positive design elements of road schemes. We also need, when we talk about trees, to address roots. I know it's unfortunate for road engineers, but all trees have them. And, we're always getting the argument against trees because of tree roots. But, if they're designed and managed from the initial stage, they don't necessarily have to be an issue. The key is that you have sufficient room for the root volume to grow. Trees also have the bonus that they actually appreciate in value and productivity as they mature. So they really are, a great return on investments, but they need to be planned for right at the design process. There needs to be a root management strategy using root directors, linear joined up tree pits, for example, and protection of roots of existing trees as well. So you can see that like high levels of movement and use by different groups at different times will promote urban integration, result in safer spaces. So, we really need to recognize all these interrelationships to gain the most from our streets and make the most of all these synergies. And we can, really only do this if we recognize their value at the start of the design process. And given that there is space in transition zones, it's great to be able to maybe have a more flexible approach to design. Things don't necessarily always have to be in a straight line, that we can make it about the journey rather than getting from A to B. And another really critical issue that we found in transition zones is topography, because, for a lot of people, changes in level can significantly affect their mobility. And a lot of our transition zones, especially in our towns that are on river banks, you will have them coming down the side of a river valley. So there tends to be, slopes involved. So having, for example, mid-slope breakout areas for opportunities to rest, to regroup with groups of kids, spots to pause and play, in very kind of simple ways, areas to enjoy the view, connect with the landscape, or just to step out of the flow of pedestrians. If, for example, kids are learning to cycle, it's all a sequence of spaces. And just again, going back to the people who use the space, the community, DiEMers advocates the pedestrian first hierarchy of road users, to encourage more sustainable travel, which is really brilliant that it does. But when we talk about people focused mobility, which is actually, the core of Ireland's new sustainable mobility policy, we kind of need to really think about who these people are. I hate the term vulnerable road users because it kind of implies, a level of strength and adversity nearly needed to get out on the streets, kind of battle of the fittest. But we do need to consider who these pedestrians that we're putting first are, their gender, their age, their travel patterns. It's not always about getting from A to B. Other aspects like viewing height, walking speed, all influence how a street is used or not by different people. And this is just an example. There's a friend of mine whose dad lives in Wicklow Town, and I was just asking her how he was getting on, and she was saying that he doesn't get out an awful lot now because he feels he's in the way. He's getting old. He feels like he's too slow. When he's out in the footpath, he's worried that if people passes him that he might fall over. And she lives in Abbeyleix, and again, her exact words were, he loves our wide, flat paths. So when he goes to visit, he goes for a walk down to the coffee shop, has his coffee and cake. She knows there are benches along the way that he can stop and have a break. The footpaths are wide that he can be as slow as he wants. He meets and chats to people. So, this is the reality of, say, how road engineering can affect social isolation, mental health. And actually, Abbeyleix is a really good example of the merits of good streetscape design. I have to say, before I do any scheme, I always look to see if the communities and the tidy towns, with over 900, I think it was, entries last year, the very fact a community is taking place is a sign that they have pride in their place. So in Abbeyleix, for example, I mean, for years it was just famous for its traffic jams, and in 1997 there was little community support for tidy towns, and its mark was one of the lowest in the county. And then by 2000, they'd actually fallen further to 11th, and this was just as the bypass and village streetscape scheme had been completed. And I know there was, at the time, it was seen as a very expensive scheme because it had a lot of focus on good public realm, quality materials, street trees. It was kind of Deemer's approach before Deemer's. So now the town's appearance had improved, but community engagement was still poor. And then you go to 2015. So at this stage, it's leading the county. It's stayed at the top since then, actually, and in its way could potentially be a national winner. And I'm not saying that the road was the only change, but it did create a street that the community took pride in, which then encourages all kinds of other positive community interactions. I'm working on a couple of schemes at the moment where there are no tidy towns groups, and I bet you, I don't know, tenor that 5-10 years time they will be engaged. And it's a uniquely Irish metric, I think, as to how communities feel about their locality, including their streets. So this is, over the years since the Transition Zone Advice Note was published, there's been the chance to work on a number of schemes, so we can kind of see the approach all the way through, which gives us great insight into the practicalities of real place challenges. This is Grangemockler, which is on the N76 in Tipperary, a fairly typical example of a rural village located on a national road, which is pretty dominated by traffic at the moment. So following the process of analysis and the road zones were identified opportunities for gateways and key areas, and a sketch scheme was developed, which we brought to Part 8 with Oliver Tierney and the road engineers in Tipperary. And really interesting thing is Grangemockler is to see how space is currently allocated. This is the transition zone link between the residential area and you can see that currently the space is really dominated by vehicular traffic, 79% of the space. And this is at the expense of other road users. There's a poor lady there walking to the shops and there isn't even a footpath. And by the primary design tool of reducing the carriageway width, there's such a significant reallocation of space, with pedestrians giving so much space from 11 to 25% to move through the village. So it does create a more equitable street and allows people of all ages and mobility to travel. And just bear in mind that these graphs don't show the quality, it's purely the quantity. So you can see in the plan below that actually there were no footpaths at the shop and the pub and the town core beforehand. But one of the things we found, I mean, all proposals, they're not, they can be hard to get through the process. At Part 8 stage, there was a complaint from one person who said that putting the footpaths in meant that they're not going to be able to drive right up to the door of the shop. So it's traffic is such a big issue when it comes to Part 8, and we found it was important that visualizations, we did these sketches for Oliver before he was going to meet one of the councillors kind of nearly the night before, just to get it over the line. And it reminds me of actually something John McCarthy said in one of the first of these talks of the series about the need to educate councillors, because these schemes can fall and rise on a couple of car parking spaces. It can be a huge barrier to approval. So it's a lesson learned for us. So again, in the transition zones, key design tools were reducing width carriageway, reducing the perceived width where we parking, we changed surface materials, introducing tree planting as vertical elements, and again, identifying these core areas. So following on from Part 8, we got Cathal O'Mara, landscape architects, and his team came on board to advance the project to tender and detailed design stage. And Cathal worked up a brilliant set of drawings, again, following the concepts that were and the strategies outlined in the Part 8 stage. And just in terms of gateways, in this scheme, after analysis, the gateways don't necessarily always align with the 60 kph. It was felt that the location of the gateway would be more appropriate at the junction where there was more space for it to be maintained. So here they don't necessarily always align. And then, key part of the analysis was just figure out where people moved, how to use hard and soft landscape to make the street safer, where the interaction with the local context helped make a better journey. For example, creating a resting spot halfway through the transition zone by the waterway, which there was future planning for a riverside park. So it's thinking that we can get as much value as we can and think ahead in the scheme. It was interesting last week, one of the speakers talked about, you know, where you tighten up radiuses as part of speed reduction measures where you get the space back. And this is what's happened here in Grangemockler, but we thought carefully, you know, all of that space didn't need to be paved. So we use landscape in to get as many functions out of it. It's got directional functions, and that it directs people to safe crossings. It's got traffic management to prevent curb mounted parking. It intercepts footpath runoff, so it has a SUDS, and it's part of the placemaking. You know, it's multifunctioning, and there's a really good example there from London. I think it's Hackney on the right, where this was actually a large roundabout that was traffic cammed, and the space was all paved over that was reallocated. But they actually went back in a couple of years ago and planted up the corners. And you can see the SUDS function. It's got a cooling effect. You know, it directs people to crossings. There's a guy there is happy to let his child out of the pram because there's a bit of a buffer. So again, when we get space back from the carriageway, we just need to think about how we can get as much value out of it as we can. So in Grangemockler, the multidisciplinary approach really carried all the way through from Part 8 to tender. You know, we all worked as a team. Fiona Bahan was a key part of it as well, TII, road safety. And, you know, for example, when we were looking at street trees, we all worked together to make sure that issues the road engineers had in terms of concerns about loadings on the curb, that we could work with that to ensure that we got our maximum capacity for tree planting. So there was, you know, back and forward between all of us. The other issue, I suppose, is that we are using a tree pit detail that is flexible in space. So if we come across utilities, it's got leeway to either incorporate the utilities or change in shape. But that does need a certain amount of multidisciplinary approach nearly to the site stage, construction stage, because we'll need to be on site and Cobble will need to be on site when the ground is opened up. So, you know, there's a bit of I suppose, uncertainty. We're also hoping to reuse materials in line with the circular economy. You know, and I know project managers hate uncertainty, but there is a certain amount of cooperation that's going to be needed right through to the construction stage. We also have a 3-year maintenance contract, and the idea being that we will have the planting all well established at the end of 3 years at handover. Another quick example is Carrick-on-Suir in Tipperary. Again, we went through the same process of analysis. And I just wanted to talk about schools which are particularly key in transition zones. The NTA recently produced the Safe Routes to School, which has some great design guidance in it. Our own document also has a focus on these particular zones as well. And just, you know, when we talk about making transition zones, you know, safe for sustainable transport, in Carrick, the school was actually with a 10-minute cycle of virtually the whole town. And, you know, talking about the 15-minute city concept from Paris, you know, the ideal is that most daily necessities can be accomplished by either walking or cycling. So, you know, applying it just in a crude catchment way to Carrick-on-Suir, it was really interesting to see again the importance of transition zones for movement. And actually the Southern Regional Assembly is advancing the 10-minute towns concept in this region. And Carrick-on-Suir wasn't one of the project areas. ARPS are doing that work, but it was interesting just to apply that concept. So again, we used all the design tools and we also wanted to create a place so that outside of school hours, in this long drag of the transition zone, and again, sloping downwards, that you would have space halfway through it that would also be a resting spot as well. So again, Cathal came on board, did have a great set of drawings. We used planting to create spaces. And again, you know, when we look at the space reallocation, we focused the hard surface, the pavement areas, on areas where the school kids will congregate, getting them safe to crossings where the bus stop is, you know, promoting the use of cycling and public transport to get to schools. And again, we've more soft landscaping as a result of this reallocation space. Quickly, this is another scheme we did in Lismore. This is just a couple of weeks old. That this is a transition zone where we had a really kind of quick design session with the area engineers just to look to see where opportunities at a very early stage of a project. And Lismore, which again is a really beautiful historic settlement, national road, again has the topography issue. It goes from the riverbank up to the castle. So we had a kind of an hour or two just discussion with all of us to see where the opportunities would be. You know, we looked at places where we could break up the extent of the transition zone, create places, create linkages to other pedestrian routes, and looking at the issue of reallocation of space. And this is the road at present. There is a really lovely historic feature there, but it's kind of lost in the hard surfacing. There's very poor pedestrian connectivity. So again, taking the 4 threads, we just looked at ideas now. This is really early stage of the scheme. So, you know, it's just sharing ideas, part of the multidisciplinary approach. So some of them may be developed, some not, but it was great to get that chance to just see what was possible. This is Luas Finglas then for another scale of project. This is, again, I consider it a transition zone because it's going through from light industrial down to residential areas, down to kind of the city core. And again, our objectives are to increase sustainable travel, create places, traffic can, and actually we met, there's a woman, Yvonne, who's a great, she does Adopt a Patch and she does a huge amount of Tidy Towns work, and she was saying to us when we met her that a lot of people don't let their kids cross the road because you have about 5 or 6 traffic lanes to cross to get over to the cinema and the ice cream shop. And we were telling her what we're doing, and she was kind of saying, gosh, it'd be great the kids can cross the road, which is not too much to ask, really. And going back to the issue of who is using the space, TII did a really good study called Travelling in Women's Shoes, looking at how gender influences traffic decisions and sustainable transport. And Barry Transportation are the consultants taking this to rail order. So they took out for us a gender survey, which was the first time certainly it had ever been done on a transportation project in TII. And this was critical because we really wanted to understand who is using the street. Who is not using the street actually is more important. So we're getting initial feedback from them, and it's amazing the information we're getting in terms of, you know, there's a huge disparity between men and women cycling, between older women and younger teenagers out on the space. So by knowing who isn't using the space, we can, you know, design measures to improve that. So just quickly, this is the junction, which Fingal County Council were also keen to create a place here as well. We worked with Tristan Dunn, who is a great road engineer in Barry's Transportation, and incorporated all the DMERS element to look at this reallocation of space. So, and again, because the project's focus is transport, it was about the Luas, it was about connectivity, it was about what connects walkability, cycling route, you know, using the space to fulfill our transport requirements, but also looking at all of the other activities that we could bring into it. And, you know, like research shows that street trees and landscaping are among the top 5 factors determining people's choice of walking routes to public transport. So creating place was really important. And just again, going back to the concept of reallocation, what really surprised me, we just did this literally yesterday, I just saw this for the first time, and I had felt that we were adding more landscape, but actually what we were doing was using all of the landscape areas so they have a function. So they're, you know, they're used to direct people to crossings, to create a place to separate the modes of transport. So we actually haven't increased the landscaped area, but we've used it just much more intelligently to get as much use out of it. And the biggest issue is that we've taken space from the carriageway and given most of that back to public transport and bus and cycling, which is, you know, again, the key project objective, if you suppose. So that's the end of my talk.
I hope you can all see that there at the moment. So myself and Eamon O'D are going to talk you through, I suppose, in terms of the Ennis Public Realm Regeneration projects. As was outlined, we were very fortunate to successfully get funding for 2 such projects covering the majority of the town centre area. And I suppose a lot of the focus on today's presentation is going to be on the first project, which is the Parnell Street Laneways and Bowways project, which completed construction in December of last year. Our next project, which is very long, O'Connell Street, O'Connell Square, High Street, Barrack Square, Barrack Street, is actually due to commence construction this summer. So I suppose the learnings from one project continued to evolve the design of the next project. And so I suppose that's the focus of where we're going to be at today. So I suppose a little bit about Ennis itself. We're the largest town in Munster, population of 25,000, and we're anticipated to grow to a population of over 40,000 by 2040. What is important in terms of town centre design, which is slightly different from Emer, is we have significant issues with space in town centre. So we have a medieval town centre streetscape, very narrow laneways, traditional buildings. We have the River Fergus there on one side of us. The whole town centre is a recorded monument. It's an architectural conservation area, and we are immediately adjacent to a special area of conservation. And look, these are all things we're extremely proud of, but they can, these all have to be factored in terms of when you're designing your projects in the town centre. And I suppose as a slight, I suppose, thing we're very proud of, we actually did win the Tidiest Town in 2021, and we were a finalist for the Friendliest Town. That's the pretty PR on Ennis. I suppose in terms of the overall planning context, and a lot of these documents you'd all be familiar with, so I'm not going to go into them. You have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the EU Sustainable Smart Mobility Strategy, Climate Action Plan, Government Plan, and you have the Regional Economic and Spatial Strategy. And I suppose these are international, national and regional strategies, all talking about sustainable mobility and climate action change and the need to examine modal shift. And I suppose these are all key documents in terms of the policies coming down and funding that is available from central government to develop schemes. And I suppose then at our own level, there's a couple of things. Obviously, our county development plan sets out a vision for Ennis as being a thriving town centre that would drive economic activity for the rest of the county. Most recently, we launched ourselves as an age-friendly town last year. And I suppose this is where, you know, community understands and responds to the needs of older persons, and that older persons are involved in making and creating a better environment. And a lot of our projects were informed through consultations with the Older Persons Council, and they are actually on our town centre stakeholders group and regularly input to various plans that we have. We equally have launched in the last year or two Ennis 2040, which is an economic and spatial plan, and that looks at having a wide range of economic, social and environmental considerations. And the idea is to have a basis for targeted investment, balanced economic growth and sustainable spatial pattern of development. So in this site, they've identified 9 transformational sites in the core of the town and surrounds to, I suppose, enable Ennis to be a town of the future and to, you know, be sustainable and have vitality. And then coupled with that, we also have published a niche destination plan. And this was done through Promote Ennis, which is a joint Ennis Municipal District Council and Ennis Chamber of Commerce company. And this is a 3-year destination management plan and a COVID recovery plan for the tourism industry. So it focuses on the development of tourism and economic activity, and a new focus for marketing in the town is based on emphasizing the role of people, community and culture. So I suppose these are all of the factors that feed into our public realm enhancement and some of the interventions that we have undertaken or plan to undertake. A lot of this has been covered in part by Emer, and if I suppose all engineers would broadly be aware of this. Again, I'm just showing the hierarchical pyramid or inverted pyramid in terms of priorities of road users, from walking at the top, obviously, to car down at the end. The requirement to reduce carbon emissions from transportation. I know Emer referenced the 10-minute town neighbourhood, and Ennis actually was a town selected as a case study in the 10-minute town study. So I suppose elements of that we are trying to progress and implement, and that is in terms of increasing the permeability within the town centre, And obviously coming forward is going to be the town centre regeneration and town first. So where did we get to our public realm design? I suppose in the original drafting of the previous county or the current county development plan 2017 to 2023, there were some health checks done on our town centre, and it was found that a number of our streets were significantly underperforming with low levels of footfall, high levels of vacancy, particularly of ground floor units, and that a number of our laneways were in poor condition, weren't very inviting, and didn't serve the function of enhancing permeability in the town centre area. So our councillors requested that we do a feasibility study, and we were very fortunate to get funding under the Commission for Economic Development of Rural Areas, or CEDRA, who gave us funding to develop a number of feasibility studies of different areas of the town. And I suppose in that we were trying to examine how can we maximise the potential of the public spaces in the town centre to boost economic activity and to create placemaking. So I suppose at that time everything was looked at, and I suppose one of the things that was requested but couldn't be delivered was the concept of coverings in the town centre, and that was down to, I suppose, access for emergency vehicles and varying building heights and the fact that we're an architectural conservation area. But I suppose the development of our overall project would have come from that original feasibility study. So obviously we went through the preliminary design and planning consents, and we were successful in getting URDF funding to deliver on the project. I suppose the key thing, public realm enhancement, is it's hard because a lot of the public perceive it as it should only be a road upgrade, and we should, resurface and on you go with the same pattern as normal. But I suppose the intent of the public realm is to look at improving accessibility and increasing dwell time, and the whole intent is if you can get those two things, it should lead to an increase in pedestrian footfall, should increase the level of street activity, and encourage more shoppers and visitors to the area. And it also will increase the attractiveness of your urban centre and enhance its pride of place. So I suppose in terms of accessibility, things we're looking at, and Eamon will go into a little bit more detail, is universal accessibility, use of shared surface, bicycle infrastructure or cycling infrastructure, the need to reduce clutter on the street, and that can be through placement of street bins, street signs, lights. It could even be locations of where planters should be, all to ensure that insofar as you can, that the town centre is permeable. And obviously through increasing dwell time, you're looking at creation of civic spaces, seating, fountains, greening. The intent is to make the town centre a more pleasant experience so that people want to visit and spend time there. And that's particularly important in the context of the growth of online shopping and the fact that it's so easy for people. Town centres have to transition to become more experience-led. And a big part of that is having a high quality, inviting public realm. So I suppose the challenges, of which there are many, but in terms of our own in Ennis, obviously the historic town centre was a significant challenge. We've extremely narrow streets, and to allow those streets to make them universally accessible in itself was challenging. We have extremely congested underground services, different levels and falls within the streetscape itself, the need for traffic management and to facilitate deliveries. And I suppose under both URDF funded public realm projects, both have resulted in loss of car parking spaces, which have been reallocated. And I suppose that is the constant challenge is, where do you provide alternate parking, or how do you manage your parking regime with a reduced number of spaces? So from there, I suppose we're going to go into some of the more detail and the technical aspects. and I'll leave Eamon talk to that. Thank you very much.
County Council and the Ennis-Smithson District were looking for a method to evaluate the town central area from an accessibility point of view. And we approached the Clare Older People's Council and conducted a walkability studies in early 2019. Now, these were undertaken with the age-friendly officer in the council, and it was a very interesting assessment because we were getting real-time information, and the Older People's Council also included people with specific needs in terms of wheelchair users, the Alzheimer's Society, National Council for the Blind, and Brothers of Charity. And the basis of all these were people that were actually using the town centre area on a continuous basis. Key suggestions from the study were improved footpaths, more seating, age-friendly parking spaces, and increasing pedestrian crossings to allow improved access to the town. The outcome of this study helped inform where funding should be spent to improve accessibility to the town, particularly for older people and people with disabilities. Now, the point about this is at that time, we had a certain fund available to us to do some work in around the town area, but what came out of it is that the key issue is that about how accessibility is very much restricted for people if they have the ability to go from one side of the street to the other at any point they so wish, and particularly at key points where they access the town from. If you go to the next page there, Leonor, please. When it came to the design considerations for the public realm project, one of our biggest difficulties in Ennis is actually our street widths. And as you can see from the drawing here, there's a significant difference in the widths on one section alone. So the way we approach this is that Deemers identifies the minimum footpath width to be, in an urban setting, to be 1.8 meters. So we struck a line from the side of the two buildings on the street. And this was a very easy way to demonstrate to the public and to the business community that for accessibility, for people to be able to access town as pedestrians, we're required to readjust the streetscape as it presently existed. So you can see in the drawing there, the two red lines running up outside the buildings, and that is your 1.8. And you can actually see at one stage there, it gets quite, the whole area gets quite narrow. Now, so in regard to future-proofing the town, it defined that a shared surface format had to be considered. If you can go on to the next thing. Okay. Now, I suppose you return to Deemers and we can all identify what's stated there about pedestrians and shared surfaces. And integrated space where pedestrian cyclists vehicles share the main carriageway. This may include streets where the entire street reserve is shared or where designated sections may provide for pedestrians and or for cyclists use in a shared surface carriageway along part of the street. Now, we went along with the purpose of we initially in one stage had a traffic street with footpaths with normal curbs, etc. on the side. But after our conversation and our outputs from the walkability study, we changed design, went back and did a further part 8 on a section of the Parnell Street project and went to a shared surface format. Now, as you can see from the two pictures here, you have on the right-hand side above is the streetscape at a junction location where the right-hand side of the picture is in an area that's not shared surface and the left-hand side is. Now, the one thing that came up in our deliberations was the issue about the core drive, which you can see to the front of the person there with the maroon jacket walking across the street. And that is in a larger area where we have plenty of footpath space. But as you go forward into the streetscape where the street is quite narrow, what we did is that it wasn't possible to continue the corridor form, because in doing so, we would have reduced the amount of available footpath outside the corridor to a very, very small area. So what we did was we put the corridor in a transverse across the footpath to identify the person approaching in that they were now going into a shared area. The depiction on the lower half here shows you the format that we used in the narrower sections. And what you have here is that we used a brush hammered curb, which is the centerpiece there, and then 3 linear granite brush hammered granite sets outside it in the channel area. And these identify between the grey footpath area, which is on the right, and the road section on the left-hand side. The pavement used is a rigid paving with, sorry, lost you there, Leonor. Rigid paving, 150 mil thick granite sets, 40 mil thick, high performance bedding mortar, 200 millimeter reinforced concrete with full expansion joints every 40 meters. And as can we get back up there, Leonor? Sorry. And as per, that would be in line with the materials and specifications under the advice note from Deemers. The carriageway paving was in herringbone form at junctions and rotational locations, and it was in linear, cross-linear form on the straight sections. Just as a matter of interest, the construction methodology used during the project was that the contractor went in and carried out their drainage works, etc. initially, and then following that, they would take out one side footpath and then proceed with the structural elements of that and put in the curbs, and then work after the curing time was over, they would start the paving on that side. Then they would switch the opposite side to the footpath the same way on the opposite side. And the last section to be done was the road section. This gave pedestrian accessibility during all times during the construction process. If you want to go on there, Leonor. If you just go back one for a second. Now, there was an important facet when we had the first section of the road completed in Lower Parnell Street. We brought back those that had been consulted with at the commencement of the works and showed them the finished product. Now, there was rather interesting interactions with different groups, but just as a kind of a context of it, the wheelchair users, cord-drive paving can be difficult to cross with crutches or other walking aids, and also a limited leg movement or painful feet. Now, they were very happy with the format where we didn't have the cord-drive on the side of the road, and we had the brush hammered curbs and the darker coloured paving outside it. Wide footpaths and doorways with crossfalls and steep ramps, doorways with uneven entrances on one side and threshold lower than the other are the worst. Now, that was a particular circumstance, that there's a number of places on the street where there's a variance in the threshold level of the premises, and we had to vary the footpath levels on one side. Seat level a bit high in some areas and for some users, but very much appreciated. The handrail to help maneuver or transfer from wheelchair scooter to bench and vice versa, very happy with that. Incorporate wheelchair accessible benches going forward, a recess area next to a regular bench so the wheelchair user can sit next to people off the main path. Older Persons Council were generally very happy with the process, and again, the seating provision was a big circumstance for them, the additional seating provision that was done. Notice the texture change in the paving at the edge of the shared surface area. There was an interesting facet from the Alzheimer's Society particularly. They identified that the colours on the seating and the colours of the hand rails and the seating need to be considered, because the differential in colour is important for a person with dementia. The other thing is that they would regard the very dark curb and sets adjacent to it as being that comes up in a 3D format to a person with dementia, and they think they have to step over it. So the person might want to overstep to go over it. It was a facet that we hadn't seen or understood before. The Brothers of Charity generally very happy with what was proposed. The one circumstance we came across, the National Council of the Blind, they do not endorse the use of shared space. They identified that a commercial element that can be brought in to advise on public realm projects during the design phase. If shared space must be used, then some paving to aid with navigation of blind people is needed, some texture or profile strip as at road edge. they were identifying the corduroy strips are very useful and they would prefer that they were used. And they did have a comment about one of our lanes where the contrast in colours weren't significant. The other thing they did identify was that they regarded that the contrast strip on the top of bollards are important. So, you know, they were interesting because we actually brought them on site and they walked the sections that had been completed and gave us their honest comments on what they saw on the construction. If you go on, Leonor, please. Okay, the shared surface signage, the traffic note that was issued in November 2021, we have these in place and we are presently identifying the locations for the smaller signs as you enter out from the lanes. As identified in this, there's three types of signs: the gateway sign, the central area shared space, and the pedestrian entry points to shared space. I would challenge that the size of this sign is quite cumbersome for an ACA area, an area of architectural conservation area. And we find it difficult, and we'll have further conversations with our colleagues in the road design section on that going forward. Okay, Leonor.
So I suppose I'm going to take over the rest of the presentation. I hope you don't mind the swapping and changing. This just is a map area showing the overall context of the public realm projects under URDF funding, and you can see the actual extent of the town centre that it covers. The hope is the fact that we are ultimately going to have a transformative project that is far more pedestrian friendly, far more attractive, and will instill more of a sense of pride, which would hopefully boost tourism and economic measures in the town centre. So I suppose a lot of the focus was on Parnell Street, which was the first project. The combination of both projects together, both are going to be almost entirely shared surface treatment. So the majority of the town centre is now going to be shared surface. There was elements that had to be considered around provision of defined loading bays, where disabled parking is going to be, the need for widened footpaths on entrances into the area, I suppose, and that's to connect the shared surface back out further to the town periphery. The need for high quality surface materials and street furniture lighting and signage. Public art is really important. What you want to do is try to engage people back in with your town centres. So I suppose in the next project, one of the features we're putting in an interactive pavement fountain. The intent is to try to reconnect families and children with the town centre, which, you know, the town itself was considered very inhospitable to persons with buggies. Based on the actual footpath widths, they found it quite difficult to navigate the town with buggies. So we want to bring a bit of joy back into the town centre. Street trees, as referenced by Emer, is extremely important. We're also putting in lightweight structures so that we can try to, you know, have multi-use of the space and have events there. And in the next scheme, we are going to be looking at incorporating rain gardens into the town centre area. And I think there are about 5 rain gardens that are proposed. So I suppose what I did want to show, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is the completed streetscape in Parnell Street. And the, I suppose the seating, took this picture randomly downtown one day, and I got chatting to that lady in the pink jacket who, I suppose post-COVID was coming back into the town centre. She had reduced mobility, and we were chatting for a bit, and, you know, I actually loved the idea of her walking right down the middle of a street without any fear of having to navigate curbs or avoid street furniture. So just to give you a couple of images of the finished product. I suppose moving on from there, where do you go next? And, you know, what's important? I suppose following on from the Parnell Street project, one of the big things we're focused on is continuing to get feedback on measures that we introduce. So as part of our age-friendly town initiative, we've actually undertaken more recent town surveys. And that involves obviously surveying older people who are both residents and visitors to the town centre and asking them around various elements of what works and doesn't work for them in the town centre. And the intent would be is that you can repeat this survey over a number of years to try to see, are you meeting the needs of an older population? Because if you can meet the needs of an older population, you should be meeting the needs of all the population. So I suppose a couple of graphs here, we had asked around enough benches or rest areas, which came back as strongly disagreed. And another strongly disagree with footpath maintenance. So, in the next schemes, we've tried to incorporate far more seating, far more greening to try to understand and make sure that our town centre is suitable and workable for all. One thing that was mentioned by Jason, and I suppose, we have extensively used whatever funding we could get, is the advantages of actually trialing out measures. And we were very fortunate that we got significant funding from the National Transport Authority under their COVID-19 interim mobility measures. And I suppose as a COVID-19 measure, given our significant issues with footpath widths in the town centre, we trialled temporary pedestrianisation. And we also reallocated road space, removed car parking in certain areas. We installed parklet. We put in brand new directional signage on the periphery, I suppose directing people into where parking was available. So there were a huge number of interventions that we trialled. And as part of trialing all this out, we formed a town centre stakeholder group, which comprised a number of the statutory authorities, the Gardaí, the HSE, all the MD councillors. We brought the Chamber on board, the Older Persons Council. We brought anti-pedestrianisation groups in the conversation, environmental groups. And I suppose during the trial, we amended hours of pedestrianisation. We added elements, we removed elements, and it actually, brought a real understanding as to how the town might function into the future. Because I suppose, part of the rationale for shared surface in the town centre is it does future-proof it if there was ever a desire to pedestrianise it into the future without any additional costs. So I suppose a lot of communication and consultation happened throughout that entire project where we trialled it. As it was brought in as a COVID measure, we actually have lifted all of the COVID measures. But what was important is we got the feedback thereafter. So following the lifting of all COVID-19 related transportation measures in the town centre, we immediately went out and did a pedestrianisation survey. And we asked people, I suppose, would they like to see it? What hours, what streets, what do they feel needs to be done to facilitate it? And I suppose the pedestrianisation issue has been a long-standing debate in Ennis, as I'm sure it is in other areas. And it's always been, very negatively perceived. And it's been trialled on a number of occasions. But in this occasion, it actually came out overwhelmingly in favour of it. So we had 92% of the respondents indicated that they would like to see pedestrianisation either now or in the medium term. Only 8% said they were against it, full stop. And actually what was very surprising is that, almost 37% favoured full-time pedestrianisation, with a further 44% favouring 11 to 7 days a week, which was far more extensive than we would have been led to believe, or the fact that our councillors would have initially been favourable to looking at. And as a result of this survey, we've introduced a second trial, pedestrianisation outside of COVID, where we have introduced pedestrian measures from 11:30 to 5 p.m. 7 days a week in the main town centre. And it may eventually evolve into a permanent pedestrianisation. So I think trialing stuff, using whatever funding is available to see what works, and communicating, measuring and evaluating can really start to bring about changes that I suppose you wouldn't think may be possible. And I'm going to finish up on the next slide or two. I suppose really in terms of things that people need to be considering when either planning at the early stages for any interventions, or certainly, as you go along, the need for close relationships with your stakeholders groups and getting buy-in to the fundamentals of what you're trying to achieve. And obviously continuing that consultation all throughout preliminary design, detailed design, and thereafter. One of the issues, and we haven't solved it yet, is there is issues with car parking on the shared surface space, where cars pull into what was traditionally the footpath area, and another car coming up through the shared surface is moving across the roadway onto what would be the other footpath area if it was a traditional road escape. And that is an area where, despite it's no parking, it is something that is occurring in small areas in the schemes. So I suppose reduction of clutter is critically important. And the next two are the next 2 or 3 are all things to consider and together. I suppose we have no line marking in our shared surface at all. We've used, as Eamon has outlined, materials and colours to designate what would be a road line, or to suggest a road line. And I suppose no line marking brings back to the car parking issue. One solution is to introduce bollards. And that's, I have put it in there. We did install sockets for putting in bollards all along the shared surface, but the hope would be that we don't ever need to install them, or we may install 1 or 2 on trial in certain areas and take them out. It is a culture change for people to get used to a shared surface area, and I suppose these are things that have to be considered. And again, I suppose by having interventions that are removable, it can allow to try to, I suppose, educate drivers and educate all users as to how it may operate. And I suppose one of the things that really we've tried to evolve is the use of greening and seating as alternatives to define the road line. And this is our next project, and slightly wider, streetscape in parts. So I think, this the picture on the smaller picture is how it looks presently. And obviously these are impressions of what it will be. And what we've done in this instance is, again, we didn't want to put bollards into a shared surface. So we have increased the amount of seating and greening to define the road line per se, to stop illegal parking into the area. Again, another consideration, this is a separate part of the same scheme. And this is where we have removed all the car parking in the area. What's interesting here is that we used a rain garden to kink out the junction as a traffic reduction measure. So we have kind of realigned the junction arrangement to actually force cars to drive slower in the area, while also incorporating greening and a nature-based solution, the rain garden itself. So I hope you've enjoyed our presentation and our learnings as we've evolved through 2 public realm projects.
If I can come back there for a minute, Leonor, sorry, be very remiss of us not to thank those that were involved in the scheme with us. Our project managers and cost consultants were Tom McNamara and Partners. Our architect was Nicholas de Jong, Associates Urban Design, and the Environmental Civil Drainage Structural Mechanical Electrical and PSDP was Maliki Walsh and Partner Engineering and Environmental Consultants. The contractor was Sheridge, and also wish to thank the public and the people of Ennis who put up with us with all the stop go through COVID and particularly the business community in the area. Thank you.